What Wes Hampton told his family sent ripples through the gospel music world that most fans never fully heard about. And the moment his children received the news, every second of their reaction was caught on camera. For anyone who has followed Christian music and Southern gospel closely, that sentence alone raises questions. Because Wes Hampton is not the kind of man whose name usually lands next to words like sudden or unexpected. His presence in the Gaither world has always felt steady, rooted, unshakable. Which is exactly why what unfolded inside his family home hit so differently than anyone could have predicted. Stay with us through this video because what comes out around the 10-minute mark is something the gospel community has talked about in private, but almost never addressed directly in public. And once you hear it, it reframes a lot of what you thought you understood about where Wes has been heading and why. Wes Hampton joined the Gaither Vocal Band in 2005, stepping into one of the most beloved institutions in the history of Southern gospel. Bill Gaither had spent decades building something that went far beyond a singing group. The Gaither Vocal Band was a ministry, a living testimony, and a soundtrack for American believers who grew up watching those homecoming video series on Sunday afternoons in their living rooms. Earning a place alongside artists like David Phelps, Guy Penrod, and Mark Lowry was not a minor achievement. By any honest measure, it was the moment Wes's career arrived, and he delivered on that arrival in ways that even optimistic fans hadn't anticipated. His voice carried a warmth and a gravity that don't often come packaged in the same singer, a baritone with enough depth to anchor a room and enough gentleness to hold a lyric without crushing it. On recordings from those early Gaither years, you can hear the group finding a new center of gravity with Wes in the mix. Fans recognized something real in him almost immediately, not a performer executing a role, but a man singing from a place that ran deeper than technique. For the millions of believers who grew up with the homecoming videos through the 90s and into the new century, Wes Hampton became part of the fabric of their faith life. He wasn't just another talented voice cycling through a famous group. He was Wes, the one whose presence on that stage felt like something permanent, something you could count on season after season, recording after recording. His life away from the spotlight seemed equally grounded. Wes and his wife LeAnn built their home in Tennessee and raised their children inside the same Christian faith that had shaped his own upbringing, the same faith that gave his performances their particular quality of conviction. While other gospel artists of his generation chased television exposure and crossover appeal, Wes kept pointing away from himself and toward the songs and the message those songs carried. That quiet faithfulness, that particular willingness to serve the music rather than be served by it, is precisely what made what came next so hard for people to see coming. By the early years of the 2020s, something in Wes's public presence had shifted, and those paying close attention could feel it, even if they couldn't name it. His posts carried a different weight than they used to. Less about schedules and stage nights, more about mornings with his children and the particular rhythms of a man choosing to be present in his own home. Fans noticed. Comments would surface under those posts, people saying that Wes seemed different somehow, that something in him looked more at peace than ever, and also more serious about something they couldn't quite identify. What those images were reflecting was a conversation happening inside the Hampton home, a conversation that Wes and LeAnn had been in the middle of for some time. A conversation about calling, about what faithfulness actually demands when two different versions of it are pulling a man in two different directions at once. The Gaither Vocal Band, by its very nature, requires an enormous amount of time away from home. The recording schedules, the concert tours, the homecoming tapings, these are not side commitments. They are the core of what the group does, and they shape the life of every artist who carries them. For nearly 2 decades, Wes had managed that reality with a steadiness that people admired. But something was turning in him, shifting in a direction he couldn't redirect with discipline or scheduling adjustments. Bill Gaither himself has spoken more than once over the years about the particular tension that lives inside a gospel artist's life. The pull between serving the wider church and serving the family God placed directly in your care. It doesn't resolve neatly. There is no formula that makes both things work without cost. A man reaches a point where he has to name what he believes God is asking of him, and then live with that answer. Wes Hampton reached that point. And when he did, he didn't process it quietly in private or announce it through a press release. He brought it to the people who mattered most, his children. And what happened in that room, the expressions on those young faces when they understood what their father was telling them, was all on camera. But before we get to that moment, there is a piece of this story that almost nobody in the gospel media space has connected to the rest of it, and it matters. Stay with us, because what Wes said in that room, and what LeAnn confirmed in the weeks that followed, is the part of this story that changes the shape of everything else. And this is where the story takes a turn that nobody in his circle expected. At least, not in the way it came together. At 47 years old, Wes Hampton sat his children down and told them he was stepping away from the Gaither Vocal Band. Not because something had fractured, not because of conflict, failure, or any of the harder stories that sometimes trail announcements like this one out into public. The decision came from a different place entirely, a conviction, built slowly and prayerfully over years, that the most important ministry remaining in his life was the one unfolding inside his own home. His children, hearing that from their father, didn't respond the way a scripted moment would have looked. Children rarely do. What the camera captured was something more layered than simple happiness or simple sadness. It was the expression of young people realizing in real time that their father was making a sacrifice on their behalf, that he was naming them as the priority out loud in a moment that couldn't be taken back. That registers differently than a birthday card or a promise made in passing. It registers the way things register when they're true. LeAnn confirmed in the weeks that followed what those who know the family had already come to understand, that this decision had been built through prayer, through honest conversation between husband and wife, and through a growing clarity that God was redirecting Wes's steps toward something more personal than any platform could offer. The choice was not impulsive. It was, in many ways, the most deliberate thing Wes had done in years. The response from within the gospel community carried exactly the warmth you would expect from people who understand what real sacrifice looks like up close. Bill Gaither, who has watched more gifted artists navigate this particular crossroads than perhaps anyone else in Christian music history, expressed respect and love for what Wes had chosen. That is not a small thing coming from the man who built what Wes was walking away from. It says something about the character of what the Gaither family represents. That departure, when it comes from the right place, is honored rather than mourned. David Phelps, who carries his own story of stepping away from the Gaither Vocal Band before eventually returning, spoke in later interviews about the weight of that kind of decision, about how thoroughly a man's identity can become wrapped up in a group like that, and how much genuine faith it takes to trust that something equally meaningful waits on the other side of leaving. His words carried the credibility of someone who had stood at the same door. For Wes, what opened on the other side was a solo ministry, built around the same faith and the same voice that had made him a recognizable presence in worship music and Southern gospel for 20 years. But shaped now by a freedom he hadn't fully known since before 2005. He could choose where to go, when to be home, what songs to carry into a room, and what to say from a platform when the music stopped. And woven through all of it was the ability to bring his family alongside him, to let his children watch from the inside what it looks like when a man follows what he believes God is asking of him, even when the asking costs him something visible and real. That is the announcement those children heard. That is what was on the camera. and hearing it described, even at a distance, carries a weight that is difficult to articulate clearly, because it belongs to that rare category of moment when a public figure stops performing his faith and simply lives it in front of the people who needed most to see it done. For those of us who have followed Wes Hampton's journey through the years, through the early homecoming recordings, through the live concert tapings, through all those Sunday afternoons when his voice came through a television or a stereo and landed exactly where it needed to, this moment reads differently than a standard career announcement. We have watched him stand on that stage shoulder to shoulder with some of the greatest voices in the history of Christian music. We have heard that baritone settle into harmonies that seemed to hold the room together by their own weight. And we have seen, across dozens of Gaither productions, a man giving his gift with evident and unhurried joy. What we are seeing now is a different kind of giving. One that doesn't come with applause or cameras pointed at a stage, but with the quieter weight of a father who decided that his children's story of faith would include the memory of a man who chose to be there, on purpose, at cost. What this says about gospel music more broadly is worth sitting with. The Southern gospel world has always celebrated the voice, the stage, the recording, and those things matter, genuinely. But the artists who carry real authority when they sing about surrender and trust and the peace that passes understanding are almost always the ones whose lives away from the microphone tell the same story as their lyrics. Wes Hampton has always seemed like one of those people, and this decision confirms it in a way that no performance could have. If you have been a fan of Wes since his first years with the Gaither Vocal Band, if you were among the people who felt something shift in the group's sound when that voice joined the lineup, and understood without being told that something valuable had arrived, then you know exactly what is meant by the idea that his singing was never only about the music. It was always about the life behind the message, and the willingness to live that life with integrity when no cameras were rolling. Watching him choose his family at the precise moment when so many men in his position would have chosen otherwise speaks to that integrity as clearly as any note he has ever sung. There is one more part of this story that most people have not connected to the rest of it yet, and it matters because it places Wes's decision inside a longer, more honest history. The Gaither Vocal Band has seen a number of gifted artists arrive at this same crossroads over the decades, and what each of them chose tells its own piece of the story. Michael English departed in 1994 under circumstances far more painful than anything Wes has experienced, and the years that followed carried their own, very public weight. Russ Taff stepped away to deal with struggles he has since addressed with remarkable honesty in his own documentary, a level of courage that the gospel community has taken decades to fully appreciate. Guy Penrod, whose baritone anchored that group for years alongside David Phelps, stepped away in 2008 to raise 8 children, a decision that surprised many at the time, but has since come to be understood as one of the most consistent choices any artist in that circle ever made. Consistent, that is, with everything he had been singing about. That pattern means something. It tells us what the Gaither Vocal Band asks of the men who carry it, and it tells us what kind of men are drawn to it in the first place. They are, almost without exception, men shaped by deep faith and family conviction. And that very depth is what eventually calls some of them away from the road and back toward something quieter and closer to home. Bill Gaither has always seemed to hold this truth without resentment. He has spoken across the years about building something designed to outlast any single voice or any single season. The homecoming movement he and Gloria Gaither built together is not one lineup. It is a family of artists whose stories intersect and diverge and sometimes circle back in ways none of them planned. Wes Hampton is one chapter in a very long book, and that chapter has not ended. It has simply turned a page in a direction that makes more sense the more carefully you look at the man who wrote it. In the years since stepping back from the Gaither Vocal Band, Wes has continued performing in solo settings, bringing that same presence and that same voice to audiences who love him, but now with a schedule shaped in part by his family rather than despite them. The worship music he carries into those rooms holds, if anything, more weight than it did before, because the man singing it has paid for something, and the people listening can feel that cost underneath the melody. What he is building in this season is still taking shape, and that is, in its own way, exactly the kind of story the people who love gospel music have always been drawn to. Not the finished monument, but the man still walking, still choosing, still trusting that the road ahead is going somewhere worth going. What happens next for Wes Hampton and his family is something the gospel community will be watching, even if the watching happens more quietly than his homecoming years did. There is a question that remains open, one that doesn't resolve cleanly yet, which is what place Wes will occupy in the longer memory of Southern gospel and Christian music. His voice has not diminished. His faith, by every visible sign, has not wavered. His family is intact, and by all accounts stronger for what he chose. But the shape of his legacy is still being written, one concert and one choice at a time. And that is not a small thing for an artist who has given as much of himself as Wes has given over 2 decades of public ministry. Whatever comes next, the fans who have followed this ministry across the years know one thing: Wes Hampton's story is not finished. The man who spent nearly 20 years giving his voice to songs about faith, hope, and the faithfulness of God is now living those same themes in a quieter register, in rooms that hold fewer people, but matter just as much. And if the world of gospel music has taught us anything across all those years, across all those homecoming tapings and concert nights and recordings made in the belief that the right song, reaching the right person at the right moment, can change everything, it has taught us that the quiet chapters are sometimes where the deepest things happen. If this story moved you, stay close, because we have been covering the longer history of the Gaither Vocal Band and the transitions that have shaped it over the decades, and what has come out of some of those stories is just as layered and just as unexpected as what we have shared here today.